All right, so today is day one, or lesson one of this curriculum. We crash course in Jewish history, 4,000 years in 5 1-hour classes. We're not going to get into super nitty gritty. If there are periods of time that spark people's interest, that could be a future adult ed, where we dive deeper into a specific era or rabbi, or I don't know, whatever. We could get into that. But for now, we're doing kind of overview, big timeline stuff. This curriculum is provided by the National Jewish Outreach Program. The curriculum is, it takes a little bit more of a traditionalist, literal approach to the Bible as history than I would. And as we get, in the later sessions, that will stop to matter anyway. But in this, especially in this first session, where we're going through early biblical up through the first temple, I'm going to have a lot of caveats, just to warn you. But then in the later sessions, by second temple period, again, there's still some stuff that's like Jewish tradition that might not be entirely rooted in academic verified history, but it starts to be a lot more like, we know that these things happened, we're just not sure exactly how they happened. So it's just this first session where it will be a little bit more like, we'll see how we get through what they have to share with us. Okay, so now Badger wants to leave the room. Hold on. Okay. So today's lesson is largely, the way that it's set up is like an overview of the Torah, mostly, but I do want to, since the topic here is not just Torah, it's history, I'll have a few caveats of things where we'll kind of we'll insert as necessary. So they do. Why is this not? Okay, there we go. There is a PowerPoint. I don't know why this is the motion for PowerPoint, but there you go. Let me share screen. Go back to the beginning and start. Okay. Enable editing. Oh my God. Why are you doing this to me? All right, hold on. Sorry. Let me stop this. I'm having technical difficulties with the PowerPoint. But can I still view it? Slideshow, there we go. Okay. There we go. All right. Crash Course in Jewish History, Part 1. So, first things first, we have the Torah, or the Bible, Hebrew Bible, is the basis of our early understandings of our Jewish history. In the last 200 years, there's been more attempts to fully uncover the realities of ancient life. There's been archaeology and the sort of creation of the field of anthropology, which I don't know exactly when that opened, but it certainly didn't exist pre-Enlightenment. So before all of that, before these things that we now can say, here are the caveats that I have, here's where what we know was actually happening in the ancient Near East, and how do we think that affected our ancestors, and where did these stories really come from, and all of that. Previously, all we really had were the stories themselves. And because they're not like all super clear, the Bible is full of contradictory comments, or like huge jumps in time, or these gaps that like are really hard to understand at face value. So we had, of course, the rabbis and their midrash and their commentary, and all of these extra layers still in antiquity, or in the early medieval times. Where antiquity ends and the medieval period begins, I think, varies based on which historian you look at. I've seen a few dates, and so the Talmud kind of bridges that gap, right? The Talmud, starting from around year 100 to 500 CE, is that it's sort of an intermediary between ancient and medieval. But in that time period is like a huge proliferation of commentary on the Bible, of sort of the setting of our understanding, our Jewish traditional understandings of our biblical stories. And at that time, they were taken at face value as history. I'm not super convinced that even the ancient rabbis believed the stories as literal history any more than we do today, but that was how they approached it. The other thing to know is that when we look at these timelines, I have also a timeline. I'm not sure if it's set into I don't think it's in the PowerPoint itself, but we can look at that separately. There's like 2 columns, and one is the Jewish calendar, based year 0 is creation, which whatever is 5,783 years ago. And then in the other column, that kind of lines up with around 2000 BCE, which of course we know 2000 BCE is not really when creation starts, but that's when Jewish history starts. And so that's the lineup of 6,000 years ago to where it coincides with the Christian calendar. So that's, or the Gregorian calendar, or the secular calendar, however you want to refer to it, but it lines up with the year 0 is roughly the birth of Jesus. So obviously that's separate. Also, what's different, the Jewish calendar, of course, exists on a lunisolar calendar, which is that our months are lunar, but our leap years are solar, so that our holidays still line up with seasons. It's not completely lunar, where the months would migrate around the seasons, but the months themselves are based on a lunar calendar, as opposed to the Christian calendar, which is completely solar, or the Muslim calendar, which is completely lunar. We're a little bit in between. In the Bible itself, the months are different. They have different names, and it's unclear if they have the same number of months. But they do still seem to have a lunisolar pattern, because even though they don't talk about leap years or whatever, but there are clear seasonal attachments to the holidays, even in the late biblical period, or the early, I guess intertestamental is not a term we would use, but the Second Temple period, there's clear attachments to the seasons. So they were using lunisolar calendar even then. Although there was some attempt by the authors of the Book of Jubilees. So again, that's that mid Second Temple period. That's a book of apocryphal. It didn't get canonized, but the authors of the Jubilees wanted a solar calendar, which is maybe why it didn't get canonized, because they were advocating a calendar we were not going to follow. So, all right, hold on. Before we look at this laws, let's pause to look at, oh wait, no, never mind. I was thinking Noah is later, but that's not true. Okay, sorry. So, as I said, this history is starting with about 2000 BCE, which is where the Jewish calendar picks up, 5,783 years ago. Being that that's not obviously like when the earth was created, but it is a few hundred years before we can date, Abraham. It's a little unclear like how our people decided that was year zero. But we wanted to post date it, I guess, past Abraham, and so that was the timeline. So of course, I'm gonna breeze through this because we know the Bible more or less. Of course, we could do lots more Bible study. We can always do more Bible study, but that's not what this is for. So creation, Adam and Eve, Noah is these are the order of the parshas. Noah and the flood. There are lots of flood stories in ancient, the ancient world entirely. I was going to say ancient Near Eastern because that's our point of comparison, but like I think a lot of cultures around the world had ancient flood stories. So Noah is definitely like it's a trope that fits in with the rest of the world. There's also, I've seen the I don't know, History Channel. I mean, this is like 20 years ago now, but History Channel special about the volcano that created a flood, like volcano in like whatever the more Central Asia that rippled down and created this flood from the Gulf of Persia or whatever and flooded the Middle East. And this is maybe the birth of all of these like Akkadian flood stories that like that's what you know of the whole world. Then yeah, of course the whole world was flooded. But I don't really know. Sometimes those history specials they're really grasping at straws. But just so you know, like Noah has a really like contextual place in history as well as in our story. From the time of Noah, it is said that there were that there was wanton violence. It was terrible. God needed to start over with a flood. And in the aftermath, that God issued laws that were for all of humanity. Noah is not considered a Jew or a Hebrew or an Israelite or whatever. He doesn't have a special covenant that starts with Abraham. So the laws of Noah are laws for everybody, theoretically, or every Abrahamic people. But they're not actually explicit in the Torah. It is clear. I mean, I would say like that it is clear in the Torah that there are things that were happening in that generation that obviously God didn't like, but it was like, you've gone astray from what I expected, like reset, follow my expectations. But it's not super clear, like it's not very explicitly laid out what those expectations are. So the rabbis filled it in later. And again, this is one of those things in the Bible, or sorry, not in the Bible, in the rabbinic literature, where they all agree that there are 7 Noahide laws. They do not agree on what the 7 are. So like there's just something magical about the number 7 that they all got there, but didn't agree totally on what they were. So there's long passages in the Talmud arguing about them. But these are the ones that got kind of accepted. I would say idol worship or blasphemy, one or the other, because they are kind of overlapping in some ways. So one or the other was on all of the rabbis' lists, and then like murder, theft, and eating the limb of an animal were also on a lot of them, or on I think all of them. Adultery is there were other is kind of a mistranslation in the Talmud and in the Torah. Like it's the same Hebrew word they're using that we find in Leviticus, where we see the laws of sexual immorality. So it's not just adultery. it's largely incest, actually, is what that term refers to, the Hebrew term. But those are the concepts: the idol worship, blasphemy, murder, theft, sexual immorality, eating the limb of a live animal or eating the blood. There's a lot of like variations in the Talmud. Not a lot. There's a couple. There's like conversation in the Talmud about what exactly was the sin in their eating practice. Is it just eating meat? Is it eating bloody meat? Is it eating the limb off, like tearing the limb off a live animal? Is it like the cruel slaughter practices? And because kashrut comes to like encompass all of those things, the rabbis, like there's there's not clear decision, but this list's landing on it. And then the obligation to set up a judicial system is another one that they landed on. Oh, come on. Next slide. There we go. All right. So after Noah, we get the patriarchs and matriarchs. Abram is the first Jew because God makes the covenant with him. And we've talked about this a little bit before in Torah study, the difference between the covenant with Abraham and then which followed through. It's made with Abraham, but it applies to Isaac, Jacob, and Jacob's children, or Jacob's sons. But how is that different from the covenant made with Moses that applies to Jews then for most of Jewish history? And we've compared it sort of to like a engagement versus a wedding, right? Like it's more or less the same covenant, but there's like the first step of commitment and like the promise of everlasting commitment, but the rules are maybe a little bendier. There's a little bit more room to like back out if you decide to or whatever. And then once the covenant is made with Moses, like that's it. Yes, Terry. Do you have a question? Oh, no. Okay. Okay. It looked like you had your hand up. Okay. So Abram is born in Ur of the Chaldeans, today in southern Iraq. This is not just a biblical name of like a place. We've sort of figured out where it is. Ur is like a real, it's on ancient maps in Babylonia. It's a little, I was just looking at maps earlier today. It's like a little bit, I think, southeast of like Sumer, in that general area of Mesopotamia. Today in southern Iraq. Abram marries Sarai. Their names were later changed to Abraham and Sarah. There's lots of midrash on why. The Torah is not very clear on why. God does do it, issues the name change, but doesn't really offer an explanation. They, of course, we know Abraham has first a son named Ishmael, whose lineage then becomes, at least in traditional, we don't know, like actually genealogically, I don't think, but in traditional understanding, Ishmael is the father of the Arabs and the Muslim people, or that Muhammad is descended from Ishmael, but Isaac is the son of Abraham and Sarah that Jews become descended from. And this special commandment of circumcision thus applies to both Jews and Muslims because Abraham circumcises himself and both of his sons. Isaac is 8 days old and Ishmael is 13 years old. Quite a difference. Okay, so then Isaac marries Rebecca, they're all like related at this point too. Everybody's marrying each other's cousins. Isaac marries Rebecca. They have twin children, Jacob and Esau. They're very different in character. Of course, oh, also this isn't on the list, but of course we know Isaac is almost sacrificed, messes him up for life, definitely affects the way he relates to his children. There's then there's all kinds of sibling rivalry in that house. Jacob steals Esau's birthright and blessing. Those are two different things, not sometimes conflated in with each other, but one is like the material inheritance and one is the covenant with God. So in two different scenes, Jacob steals both. And then he flees and marries Rachel. Well, falls in love with Rachel, works for 7 years, is tricked into marrying Leah first, works for another 7 years to marry Rachel, works for another 7 years to inherit the flock. And by the time they leave, after 21 years in Haran, he has 2 wives, 2 concubines, well, 13 children, at least. There might be more daughters than Dinah. It's a little unclear. And like a huge flock. They've become very wealthy people. Rachel also steals in this like scenario when he starts to leave the household gods of Laban. And this is a little unrelated, but I was just reading something on I've been reading up more on Jewish afterlife, just because there are so many details that like got lost in the wayside. Whoops, sorry. Not ready for that. In the last 3,000 years. And the Hebrew word for the household gods that Rachel steals in Genesis, they're believed to actually be like divination tools, or like maybe not divination tools, but like idols to like ancestor worship, that they were idols intended to help communicate with dead relatives specifically, which is interesting to me. But anyway, so here we've got the family tree. There are parts of this that could like be a circle, but anyway. So Laban is right, Rebecca's brother. They're Laban's daughters. There's Midrash that Bilhah and Zilpah are also Laban's daughters, but from concubines of his own. So they are lesser daughters, and that's why they don't get married off. They get sold off. But anyway, I think we know a lot of this. The 12 tribes of Israel, most of them come from Leah. Bilhah and Zilpah have 2 each. Rachel has 2. She dies giving birth to Benjamin. Reuben, the oldest of all of the sons, has an affair with Bilhah, who, as the youngest concubine, might be appropriately aged, but that's definitely in that list of sexual immorality in Leviticus, not to uncover the nakedness of your father's wife or concubine. So he did not follow those Noahide laws. All right. The story of Joseph. We know this story. Another thing that's interesting though that I came across in preparing for today is around this time period, a little after, but like in the time period of the Israelites in Egypt, there was a dynasty that arose so not in the period of the Exodus, not the part we know, but the 200 years in between, where the Torah kind of skips over. There was a short-lived dynasty of rulers in Egypt that came from the Middle East. And so Josephus posits that maybe they were Jews, and when they were overthrown, that's when Jews would have been a misnomer, or anachronistic, but that they were Israelites, and when they were overthrown, that's when they were enslaved, which is interesting to me. But then other ancient historians say maybe they were Philistines, but anyway, they came from like the Canaan, like they came from a little further east in the Levant, and then they came and conquered Egypt and were there was like 3 generations of kings. There was a short-lived dynasty, but kings of Egypt around like shortly following when it would have, if we matched up the dates and we assume that Joseph, and his brothers were real people, like, I don't know. I think that's interesting. So Joseph lands in Egypt. His brothers follow without realizing it. All of the Israelites end up in Egypt for 200 years. The Exodus happens. Joseph's tomb. So at the end of the Exodus, or in the Exodus story, they bring Joseph's bones with them out of Egypt. And so this is in Israel, where his tomb is believed to be. Of course, the other, Jacob, Isaac, Abraham, Leah, Sarah, and Rebecca are all buried in Machpelah in Hebron. This I think is in Nablus. I'm not sure where exactly the tomb is, but it's not with the others. And then Rachel has a tomb. There is a Rachel's tomb you can visit. I don't know, so somewhere a little further south where Rachel's believed, according to where, like near Beersheba, where it says she dies in the Torah. But in the Torah, it kind of says like she's got this hasty burial. So it doesn't seem plausible to me that she would have a full tomb. Like it says like Jacob buries her pretty quickly, and then that's why in Jeremiah she's the matriarch wailing, welcoming home the exiles, because she's like on the side of the road. But anyway, there are tombs throughout Israel that contain these stories that have this history that you can go. A lot of them are in the West Bank, so not always safe to explore, but if you have a tour guide, you can go and see them. All right, so then of course Moses leads the people out of Egypt. He's the youngest of 3. He is the one born during the period of drowning all of the Egyptian boys. The Hebrew boys in Egypt, so that's why Aaron is unscathed. Although, my theory that Aaron has classic middle child syndrome and is not unscathed from family trauma, but at least from attempted genocide, he's relatively unscathed. But Moses gets sent up the river to be rescued by the daughter of Pharaoh. In the rabbinic, in the Bible, she doesn't have a name. In the rabbinic literature, she's referred to as Batya, daughter of God, instead of daughter of Pharaoh, because she does this holy thing by rescuing Moses. Moses at some point seems to realize that he is a Hebrew. He runs away. He kills an Egyptian. He runs away. He marries Zipporah, a Midianite, which is like just another nomadic people of the desert, of the Sinai Peninsula. And as a shepherd, this is important that there's a lot of like shepherding references in both, a little bit in the Bible, but more so in the rabbinic literature, but that the people who are our strongest leaders were shepherds, like Moses and Jacob and David. So, Moses is out shepherding, herding the sheep, and one trails off, and that's when he finds the burning bush. Like that's a trope that probably again was shared by other like ancient Near Eastern cultures, that there's this idea like if you can shepherd sheep, you can shepherd people. Of course. All right, so the Exodus, we know this. Jews left Egypt, 10 plagues, Passover, the lamb's blood, all of the things. Historically, there's not enough archaeological evidence to prove, or to prove is a strong word, but to support this concept that 500,000 Israelites left Egypt all at once and traveled the desert for 40 years. There would be remnants in the desert if that happened, even for a nomadic people, even for a people that didn't leave like ruins per se. There would be stuff in the archaeology there that's just not there. So some people say it never really happened at all. Some people, whatever. There's different explanations. There's I think the prevailing Jewish historical belief right now that I'm partial to, is this idea that well, there was constantly coming and going between the Levant and Egypt. We see that in other ancient records, and we see that in other parts of the Bible, right? Like when Abraham first gets to Canaan from Mesopotamia, there's a famine, so he goes to Egypt to eat. Like there's Jeremiah, when the Babylonians are conquering, and he escapes to Egypt. Like there's so much like back and forth of that area. They were neighbors, that was normal. So there's one belief that like there was maybe a mass exodus of like a few hundred people leaving at once, like a community of Israelites leaving at once. Possibly Levites, like that's as the priests. There's like a theory that they were the ones that left and then conquered, or not conquered necessarily, but settled in Israel and elevated themselves amongst the Canaanites and sort of like banded together the other remaining Israelites that had never really left Israel from the previous years. I don't know. So there's that concept, but we don't really know exactly what happened. We know something, that there was movement between Israel and Egypt, that something happened that like sealed itself in our people's sacred mythos, and that there's no way 500,000 people roamed that desert for 40 years. So something in between happened that we're not sure about. And the dating here is approximately 1250 BCE. So we've got everything from Adam and Eve to Moses is approximately 800 years. And now we start to get into stuff that is a little bit more archaeologically verified. So 1250 is the Exodus. The Mishkan, we know, is the tabernacle. There's very vivid blueprints in the Torah about the Mishkan that became also sort of the starting place for the temple, although in the Book of Kings, Solomon also gets blueprints for the temple. So it's not like he relies totally on the concepts from the Mishkan, but the design structure is similar. Like the outer courtyards, the inner layers, the Holy of Holies, they're intended to reflect one another. And in some ways, modern synagogues were then constructed to reflect that as well. Although obviously we have less, we don't have sacrifices. So some of the layers of courtyard and people, and we don't live in our synagogues. Although some rabbis have sort of like rectories or what have you adjacent to the synagogue, but they wouldn't, the way the temple housed the priests would have been different. But we have our like the meeting hall, or in our case the lobby, but like a lot of synagogues have like an entryway first. You don't enter right into the sanctuary. You have the sanctuary, then you have the ark with the Torahs, that's sort of the Holy of Holies. So it's very it's structured to reflect that. Moses is one of the only important biblical characters that doesn't have a tomb you can visit. It doesn't have even a educated guess on where his like grave would be. Where some later generation didn't try to construct a tourist site in his name. Partly because like in the Torah, it's so like it's important that like God buries Moses. There were no other people with Moses when he died. So it's not like there's nothing there to mark the grave, and that's important in the Torah itself. I don't know that I necessarily agree with this like last part here, that the reason for that exclusively was to keep Moses from becoming a deified person, because like I said, we have all these other tombs, and they are tourist places, and they are certainly like to some degree places of pilgrimage, but they were never deified. I think David maybe would have liked himself to be deified a little bit, if I'm being honest. But his tomb is it's a place you can visit in Israel. And it's not in the West Bank. It is in a safer neighborhood in the old city of Jerusalem. But it's I don't think any of them feel like altars per se. After Moses died, Joshua becomes the Israelite that leads the people into the conquering of Israel. 40 years apart in the month of Nisan. That's one of those things that the tradition gives you these like occasionally the tradition gives you these very specific timelines that you're just like, okay, sure. Like the destruction of the first and second temple both being on the 9th of Av. Okay, sure. Like, but meanwhile, we have these huge gaps in time of, how long were the Israelites really in Egypt in the first place? Was it 200 years? Was it 400 years? It depends on which part of the Bible, like where you're counting from. And then all of a sudden you get these very specific markers. But we're getting into 1200, 1100 BCE here, the conquering of the Canaanites. And this is one of those things too in the Bible where we have to be willing to look at with a critical eye, both in terms of like, I feel like our own apologetics for our ancestors, but also if we want to know what really happened. So Joshua, not Joshua the person, the book of Joshua, details these like complete levelings of communities. In some places it says like clearly like they rolled through, they asserted like this is Israel now, deal with it, and as long as the Canaanites in that town accepted that, they left them alone. But in some places there's like ethnic cleansing happening. But then later in the Bible, in the prophets especially, where there's all of this like, and the Israelite men were marrying Canaanite women and they were worshiping Canaanite gods and all of these things that like, if Joshua's men had really decimated these communities, clearly that wouldn't be happening. So there is some of this that's like very traditional, ancient, I think especially ancient Middle Eastern ways of recording history, where it's like, we smashed them, we like so thoroughly crushed them, don't mess with us, we're very tough. And like that's not really what happened, but that is part of how those epics were created. For example, there is a scroll from around 1250 BCE from a pharaoh that says like, we've conquered the Hebrews. And it's sort of believed in certain circles of like Jewish historians that that's the reference to the Exodus, that the Israelites left of their own, I guess it could go either way. So the prevailing message I've heard from certain circles of Jewish historians who really want to reconcile the Torah narrative with archaeological evidence is that the Israelites left of their own accord, of God's urging, went back to Israel, and the Egyptians like dealt with it by saying, we've conquered these evil Hebrews, instead of admitting we lost all our slaves. But I guess now that I'm saying that out loud, it could also go the other way, that like maybe the Egyptians expelled the Israelites and the Israelites covered them, like their own narrative, by being like, no, God told us to leave. It was just time to go. Which is like, I don't know, that's funny to think about. I never really put it that way before. But my point is that kind of narrative rewriting was very common. So I mean, there was no Twitter eyewitness accounts in real time to like catch you on those lies, right? There was no video cameras or whatever. So like you could just kind of make up whatever narrative suited you, as long as it had some tenuous connection to reality that wasn't, so obviously a lie. Sorry, I see there is a chat message. Oh, okay. Here I had to go. All right. So that's what's happening with Joshua and conquering the land. There we go. All right, periods of judges and kings. Judges is a lot of cycles of like, all right, so Joshua's dead. The people are left to kind of figure it out. God is very clear that God does not want the Israelite people to have a king. But they keep asking for one. They want to be like the other nations. And God keeps warning them, like, kings are human. Humans are prone to the power of corruption, the corruption of power. I'm your king. I am perfect. I am infallible. Like, stop trying to be like the other nations. You're not like the other nations. But eventually, God caves and sends Samuel the prophet to anoint Saul, the king of Israel. My opinion on Saul, these are my hot takes about the kings, okay? My opinion on Saul is that he was a paranoid schizophrenic, that he was really truly trying his best for the people of Israel. He didn't super want to be king, but he did it. Just like Samuel didn't super want to anoint him king, but he did it because this is what the people needed in the moment. But like his paranoia got the best of him and he got real crazy by the end. So he's deposed. David takes his place. Should have been Jonathan, Saul's son. David plays all of Saul's children like fiddles. David is a narcissistic personality disorder. But he becomes king. Here's another piece of like where the history and the we're not in Torah anymore, but the Tanakh start to differ. We're not entirely sure, but like there's parts of the Tanakh that posit that David is this musician in Saul's court, and then like politics his way into being in good graces with all of Saul's children and then usurps his throne. And then there's, of course, the famous narrative of like, David was just a simple shepherd boy and then came and saved everybody from Goliath and the army from Gath. And then in the book of Chronicles, which is largely retellings of the books of Samuel and Kings, there's a different story about a different shepherd boy who slings his slingshot and kills a giant of Gath. I don't think the name Goliath is used there, but a giant from Gath. And it's clearly the same story. And so historians think, this is again one of those places where we just get to rewrite our narrative because there's no, like, who's going to know that David was in fact the musician, that part of the story is true. He was a musician in the court and politicked his way into being king. He was not a shepherd. He did not sling the slingshot. He did not kill Goliath. he stole that story from this other local hero and like absorbed it into his own mythos to make him look good. So there is that. After David dies, Solomon ascends the throne. Solomon is renowned for his wisdom, but to be honest, I don't feel like we see a lot of that in Tanakh. He has a few scenes where he like adjudicates wisely, but it's not like super astute. Like he's, I don't know. I guess if we really believe that he knew what was going to happen with those two prostitutes and the baby, then that's pretty astute. But it feels like a pretty big gamble that he was like, yeah, let's just cut the baby in half, see what happens. So, you know, and then he taxes the crap out of his people. He was not a very popular king, actually, because he overtaxes them. And yes, he built the temple with some of those taxes. That's a big deal. But then he also builds a giant palace for himself and his 1,000 wives. So like, I don't think the people like that part very much. Samson's tomb. Samson is one of the judges. Again, my armchair diagnosis, sociopath. He tortures animals. Not a good look. The Cave of the Patriarchs, this is in Hebron, the city of David, this is in Jerusalem. Okay, so looking at, that's the end of the slideshow. I want to look at the timeline again, which will have some overlap with the things, all of the things I just said, but just to give you a little, again, more sense of like what the biblical narrative with history and the timing. Right, so year 0 is approximately 6,000 years ago. The world is desolate of Torah. This, to me, this is just a funny, like, this is what was happening in the world. There was no Torah, and so everything was chaos. I don't know. So this is, and we looked up, I was looking up, oh, my tabs aren't still open up here, you can't see, but I was doing some Googling of like other, right, like here we have the Code of Hammurabi, so it's like, well, where does that match up with like the Epic of Gilgamesh, because that's often also upheld as like the earliest written mythos or whatever, and just like with the Code of Hammurabi having some influence on the laws of the Torah, the Epic of Gilgamesh possibly had some influence on some of the characters of the Torah, or like the tropes, like the flood. So the Epic of Gilgamesh actually even predates a lot of this, like it, or I guess it's on the earlier end of this period of the creation, the flood, the Tower of Babel. Epic of Gilgamesh is dated to roughly 2900 BCE. So, yeah, so like way even before the beginning of Jewish history. But that would have been the world from which Abraham, Noah, like that these ancient characters emerged from, right? Because even though our history really starts to take root in the land of Israel, which is, you know, a couple 100 miles, all of the other characters, they start, like Abraham's born in Ur, like I said, that's in Mesopotamia. The place of like Ararat, where the ark lands after the flood, that's in, you know, Mesopotamia. That's a little further west. I mean, that's Iran, but that Adam and Eve, like between, you know, it's believed or not believed, but the way the Torah describes the Garden of Eden, like it would have been somewhere between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Like it's in this fertile crescent that all of our stories start from, even though then our people came further down west and south, or I guess mostly west. But anyway, that this other piece of history of the Gilgamesh and all of that, like it clearly had its influence. It's relevant. So there's all of that. It also, this is like not a major thing, but I was looking up a friend of mine, and we were kind of going through this. I was showing what I was going to teach later today. We were talking about Hammurabi and Gilgamesh, and then he was like, "Oh, he was like Hammurabi? That sounds familiar. Is that the um the ancient like Yelp review?" So I was like, "What are you talking about?" Because I had no idea what that meant. So we Googled it, and there is this ancient Einasir, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but E-A or E-I dash N-A-S-E-I-R was apparently an ancient copper merchant around the year 2000 BCE who lived in Ur. He traveled to Dimun or Dilmun, which was again a town I didn't, or a city state or whatever of Mesopotamia that I wasn't familiar with, but in looking it up, it's believed to be where the Garden of Eden might have been, because it's like right is in that, in that like floodplain between the Tigris and the Euphrates. And he apparently was like a known con man, that in the ruins around his home, there were several tablets of like, where is my copper that I paid for and you haven't sent me? The copper that you sent me is bad. I'm sick of getting bad copper. Why are you still selling copper in Ur? You're a con man. And all of these complaints on like, I mean, imagine trying to chisel in cuneiform into tablets your complaints about this copper seller. I think it's hilarious. Anyway, so that's the time frame we're talking about here. Hyksos, these are the shepherd kings. These are the dynasty I was mentioning, that around this time of when oh, I guess it's a little earlier than I had said. But that Josephus believed the Hyksos might have been Jews. A lot of other ancient historians say actually they might have been Phoenicians or Canaanites. We're not really sure, but they invaded Egypt and ruled over Egypt for like, yeah, a couple hundred years. They had a relatively short dynasty, and then were overthrown. And so then the 18th and 19th dynasty, those are the pharaohs that we know of, that again, like, so our part of the history and a lot of this is not super verified, but like Thutmose, Ramses, Pitom, these names that do appear in the Exodus story were real pharaohs. Like, some of it's verifiable, but the idea that we built the pyramids, probably not. I love this disclaimer on the caption here, if you can see. Moses and the 10 Commandments, not the real thing. In case you thought this very blurry picture of Charleston Heston was a real life photograph of Moses. Okay, so 250, close. Oh, yeah, close to 2500 BCE. Wait, that's not the time frame I was told, or I had heard before. This is a little earlier. 1476. I thought 1250 BCE. So this column is the Jewish year, right? We're working up to 5783 to today. And this column is the BCE column. So here during the time of Joshua, Canaanite and Phoenician culture dominate Israel. The interesting things about the Phoenicians is that they are sometimes, oh wait, no, sorry, I'm thinking of the Philistines, never mind, that they are sometimes the one of the main like foes in the later part of the Bible, you know, in the era of kings and stuff from the Israelites. But they too likely came from further west, that they came from the islands, possibly in the Mediterranean. Like the name Philistine means like sea people or something. So just like possibly the Israelites came from Egypt. You know, there's lots of like, the Canaanites were the real indigenous people. They got overrun. Okay. Here, the early Greek states founded, just again, so we have that parallel timeline, understanding what's happening in the Bible and what's happening in the world. It's like, I also, this friend and I that were talking about some of this when we were looking up Hyksos, and we were looking up the generations of the pharaohs, and he was like, well, when was Cleopatra? And I was like, well, she comes way later. But so not even early Greek states. I mean, she's from Hellenized Egypt, but she's pretty close to the year 0. She's like 50 BCE. But this is this is when the early Greek states are founded. So it's the beginning of like what we think of in Greek history, ancient Greek mythology, and where sometimes it feels like so separate from our history and mythos, like because we learn about it in school, and like, I don't know, I guess because there's not really still people that believe in the Greek pantheon, the Greeks became Orthodox Christian, that it feels so like outside of our historical context. But to think of like a lot of what becomes our real history, like the later biblical period, is happening side by side with these ancient historical Greek stories that were like taught in school, and that they're really not that far apart. I mean, the Mediterranean is like not that big. And I don't know, the influence there, we forget sometimes, I think, as modern Jews, how much Hellenistic culture had a huge impact on early post-biblical Judaism. But I guess we'll get to that next time. Okay. So David, this is what, I meant to say this when we were looking at on the slideshow too, but that's why I wanted to look at the timeline separately. David is the first person in the Bible that is archaeologically verified. My position is that if David is archaeologically verified, if he has this kingdom that we have all these ruins for, we have the ancient currency with his face on, all of this, then he couldn't have sprung up out of nowhere. So if David, based on the amount of relics we have of David, going backwards, Saul, Samuel, Eli, who is the priest that raises Samuel, they must be real too. And the altar, that's not the word I want. Temple, shrine, that's the word I want. The shrine at Shiloh, which is where Samuel grew up before, right? Because David brings the Holy of Holies into Jerusalem, and Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem. So prior to that, there were these like little shrines around the country, and Shiloh was the one where the Holy of Holies was being kept before then it's captured and David recaptures it. Anyway, so the Shiloh, there are ruins found of the shrine at Shiloh too. So that's again like even though Eli and Samuel aren't, there's no evidence of them as people, I feel like that part of the story has enough evidence around it that I feel like, yeah, here's where we start to get like really historically grounded. Before that, there's the places in the Bible where it gets like fuzzy. That to me are the places where like I'm not so sure that these people were real, and like somehow our ancestors needed a way to connect these other stories. Like, okay, so for example, in Judges, where there's these cycles, these like quick vignettes of people acting up, and then somebody comes and saves them, and then like they thank God and they're good again for a generation, and then they start acting up again. And it just gets like, the timeline gets very fuzzy, and it's very like tropey, like the things that just happen again and again and again. Like it feels like a fable. And so, and then we get Eli, and like then the narrative really starts up again with Eli, and then Samuel and Saul and David and blah blah blah. And similarly, like Abraham, we've got like Adam and Eve, and then like, oh, then there's all these genealogies and like sort of one-line stories, like Enosh walked with God. What does that mean? And like it gets really fuzzy and jumbled. And then you have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. There's these very clear, concise periods, and then it gets jumbled again. So my theory, or my sense, is sort of like Abraham, probably a real person, that his family had these key oral stories that, like, as oral stories did, got, exaggerated or whatever over time, but that they were based on a real family and a real people. And then we have this huge gap where like the history got shuffled around a bit, or got lost. And then when the Israelite people sort of re-solidify, they need to bridge that gap, that they find themselves in need of making the mythology fit together in a neat way that maybe it didn't originally. Like maybe these were disparate stories, but to make it all feel like one cohesive, like we are the chosen people, it was necessary to fill in some of those gaps. And that's where the things get like fuzzy. But that's my personal take on like what I've seen from history, like from the archaeology and from the rabbinic, like in the traditional view. And to me, that stuff is interesting. I really like history. I think ancient peoples are fascinating, how much we've stayed the same and how much we're different. Like the Yelp reviews of this copper seller, like that's hilarious to me, and so to me, I really enjoy that sort of project of like, okay, like let's look into the biblical narrative and find what's real and what's not, and where's the history come in and where does it diverge. And to me, I find that fun, and I can divorce it from when I do want to look at the biblical narrative at face value and find the spiritual meaning of it. Some people find it very difficult to reconcile those two. And so I don't want to like create this misconception that if I'm saying some of this didn't really happen the way it's written, that I'm dismissing its spiritual like meaning. And I don't want to create the misconception that like when I am preaching or whatever on Friday nights, that when I'm saying like this is what happened, that I am in denial about the history. I find both of those things meaningful, and that, reality is probably somewhere in between what the like pure academics say and what the traditionalists say. And to me, that's like a fun exercise, but I know that's not true for everyone. So I'm just curious, that's the end of like lesson 1. If anyone has like questions or comments on that last bit, or whatever, before we close.
Oh, just like it's one of those mysteries. You can accept look for the history and accept that the story of Noah or Abraham or any of that is real spiritually for us and has its definite purpose of building who we are. And we can accept it as real on that level and then look for the history. I mean, sort of like what you said about the history of what's going on in the world around Israel. It's that kind of thing. You've got the history around our personal stuff, and yeah, they can exist side by side.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks everyone for sticking through that timeline with me. And next time we'll pick up, from the eras of the first destruction, from the Assyrian and Babylonian conquests, through the next couple 100,000, however many years. I'll see you then.